Hello students, welcome to Physics Wallah. I'm Harpreet Singh and I'm going to take your Anthropology optional. Students, today the topic that we're going to take is a very interesting one. The one which basically is related directly or indirectly to most other topics in the Anthropology optional. And that topic actually forms a core of the physical anthropology. The topic being fertility and fecundity. So let's see what this topic is, what are the various intricacies associated with this topic, what it basically means, what are the differences, and how it is related to the various branches of anthropology. So let's start. Now, when we start or before we deal with the intricacies of this topic, let's understand which topics of the syllabus are related to this topic, fertility and fecundity. If directly we see Unit 11.1 and Unit 11.3, they directly mention the concept of fertility. What is fertility? What are the fertility differentials and various dimensions? But this is per se directly mentioned in the syllabus. But when we read about the demographic profiles, or even when we are studying the archaeological dimension also, this topic is actually very important. So students, remember, if you understand this concept, you will be able to understand the other dimensions also very well. So let's start with this topic. Try to understand what is the core concept behind this topic. So if that gets into your head properly, then there is no need to mug up all the definitions and all. So let's start with the topic. Fertility. So the first topic that we're going to study is fertility. So what is fertility? Now, if I define fertility from a layman's perspective, what is fertility? It means basically the ability of the people to produce healthy offspring in abundance. That means from the definition point of view, if a particular person, a woman, is producing a lot of children, that in simple words can be said as fertility. That means ability to produce a lot of children. But that is from a layman's perspective. And if you're writing your anthropology optional, then this definition does not work to that extent. So there's a famous anthropologist, W.J. Wood. Now, this anthropologist has basically defined the concept of fertility as the actual birth performance. Now, when you are defining this, you need to mention actual birth performance. Now, we'll understand this word, what it means. But before we understand this, just remember, when we define this, this is for your understanding. The ability to produce maximum offspring is fertility. But from an anthropological point of view, it is the actual birth performance. Now see, how to understand this? Understand the topic concept that I'm going to explain you now. When we say actual birth performance, it is like a jargon to us. How can performance be related to this? But see, whenever we study fertility, there are certain terminologies we come across. Let's say the fertility rate, the replacement rate, which these topics or points we're going to study later on also. But for the timing, let's see, the fertility rate in India is 2.2, right? For the timing, let's take fertility. What does this word mean? 2.2 per se means that every woman who is able to reproduce or in a reproductive age on an average has approximately 2.2 children, right? So when I write 2.2, it is a quantifiable term. What does quantifiable means? Quantifiable means it is somewhat visible or I can count. So what is being quantifiable? Quantifiable means that can be counted. What can be counted means it can be measured. if it can be measured, its performance can be identified. That means actual birth performance means the quantifiable entity in this terms when we refer to as fertility, because it can be measured. Unlike the fecundity, which we're going to read or understand after this, over here, actual birth performance means a quantifiable entity. That means approximately 2.2 is the fertility rate, or on an average there are 2 or 3 children a particular person is having. So something visibility in terms of quantity is there. So this is what the concept of actual birth performance is when we study from an anthropological point of view. So students, if we are understanding or studying fertility, we need to understand or remember 2 things. First, from a layman's perspective, it is the ability of the people to produce healthy offsprings in abundance, right? From an anthropological point of view, you need to mention the thinker for sure. In order to gain marks, you have to mention W.J. Wood defines fertility in the form of the actual birth performance. So this is the concept of fertility, right? Now let's move on and understand what is the next concept, that is fecundity. Now, often we come across words fertility and fecundity, we generally think they are one and the same thing, but actually they are different, and that is why in anthropology syllabus it's very predominantly mentioned what they are, and we need to understand and differentiate them well. So let's see what fecundity is. It is the biological capacity to reproduce. Now see, it's like again a jargon for you, might appear like a jargon, biological capacity. Now see how I should differentiate, or we should differentiate it from fertility. When we read fertility, we read it is the actual birth performance. That means the visibility aspect. Now when we are reading fecundity, it is the biological capacity. It means, does a human being have the ability to reproduce or capability to reproduce or not? The word capability is the important dimension. Now I'll give you an example. Let's see. For example, when we study transgenders, the transgenders do not have the biological capacity to reproduce. So that means the fecundity is lacking. So because they do not have the biological capacity to reproduce, the fecundity will be null. Similarly, I give you an example of, let's say, a man, his testicles are missing. Now when the testicles are missing, his biological capacity to reproduce is not going to be there. So that means that person's fecundity is not there. So this is the basic concept of fecundity. Now this was one aspect of fecundity when we define this. There is another very important definition and dimension of fecundity which helps us to relate this concept with the previous concept of fertility. So let's see what is the other dimension. Next is the maximum potential to reproduce. Now remember one thing, before we understand this dimension, when we studied fertility, I said the visibility part, or when I mentioned fertility rate 2.2, that means we can quantify it, right? We can quantify fertility. But when we talk about fecundity, it is a qualitative term. Qualitative term. Now we'll understand both of these together so that you understand the concept well. So what it means, see, if I say the maximum potential to reproduce, can I say or measure for that matter that the maximum potential of X person is this, Y person is this? No, because it will be influenced not only by the biological dimension but also by the cultural dimension. For example, one couple might be having 10 children, another might be having 2, the third might not be have any. So we actually cannot measure the maximum potential, but hypothetically we say this is the maximum potential. That means it is a qualitative term, not a quantitative term, right? So let's see the maximum potential. If I use a graph, right? Now remember, this graph is going to help you understand the relationship between fertility and fecundity also, right? Let's say, for the matter, this side represents the number of offsprings or children. Supposingly, this is rising, and there is this level, and hypothetically we are extrapolating it, right? Now this region, which is the maximum, is the maximum potential of a particular species. For here, humans. So this is a maximum potential. So this will be the fecundity. Now supposingly, as I mentioned, this is a number of offspring. Supposingly a particular couple, let us say couple A. Now couple A might be having supposingly one child. They might be having, say, 2 children, 3 children, 4, and this is this maximum level. Now how fertility and fecundity is written? When I'm saying 1, 2, 3, 4, it is representing the fertility because I can measure it, right? Now this graph was of fecundity. How fertility and fecundity are being related? See, when the fertility rises to this level, it becomes equal to fecundity, that is a maximum. So what does this graph brings about the relationship? That is fertility is less than or equal to fecundity, can be, right? Supposingly, if we see this graph, maximum potential is this point. So let us say FC, fecundity. Fertility over here, for example, 1 child, so less, 2, 3, 4. If it reaches a maximum also, then also it will be equivalent, not greater than that, right? So fertility is less than or equal to the fecundity in every case, because fecundity refers to the maximum potential to reproduce in the number of words, if we say, because it is a hypothetical term, we cannot actually quantify it. That is why we say qualitative term, right? Fertility is quantitative term. So it is a potential, and fertility is less than or equal to fecundity. So this is the relationship between fertility and fecundity. So now let's move forward and understand what are the differences between them, because we have understood what is the definition, what is fertility, what is fecundity, and what is the relationship. So let's see what are the differences. Now, when we study fertility and fecundity, it's very important when you are studying or writing in the examination, use the concept of this line, drawing the line and presenting it this manner. What happens is, generally, this is a unique paper in itself, that it is very objective in nature, because this is a biological dimension related to, and even the cultural dimension would come. But if you write in a very objective manner, it's visible to the examiner, and once it's visible, the tendency of getting more marks definitely increases. So be clear, be precise when you're writing them, right? So let's begin with the differences. See, whenever a question comes, what are the differences between a particular term with respect to the other term, use the concept as a first difference, as a concept or a definition can be used as a first difference. For example, if I define over here fertility, we had mentioned the maximum ability to produce healthy offsprings. Or if we remove the maximum term also, then also it is no issue. We can just simply say the ability to produce healthy offsprings. When we mentioned fecundity, it is the biological capacity. Biological capacity to reproduce. So the first difference generally should be the concept or definition, what it defines. Basically, it is the ability to produce healthy offsprings in abundance, as we had studied. And this is a biological capacity, whether a person is able or has a capacity to reproduce or not, right? So now let's see what is the second difference. Now the concept comes, do you think these terms can be modified or are modifiable? Yes, fertility is modifiable. Now I'll tell you how. First let me write modifiable. And this is not, that also I'll mention why. See, as I mentioned earlier also, supposingly a couple might be having 2 children, other might be having 10, other hypothetically might be 12 children, or another couple might not have any children. That means because it is a quantifiable term, that means it can be measured also and it can be altered also. See, depending upon the choice of the couple. So the fertility rate or fertility per se will also change because of the choice of the couple to have the number of children they want to have. So this concept of fertility or fertility rate, if it is measured, can be changed. When we come to fecundity, I had mentioned it is the maximum potential, top of the graph, right? We had studied that. That is fixed, maximum. So this cannot be modified. That is not or non-modifiable. Right? Third difference, which I have been mentioning from the start of the lecture, it is a quantitative term or terminology for that matter. This is a qualitative term, right? As I mentioned, because it can be measured, it cannot be. It is just a for now the question would arise, when I had drawn the graph, over here also maximum potential would also be something. Yes, you are right in that matter. But remember, the maximum potential is a irrational, or for example, a hypothetical term, because it cannot measure the maximum potential. That is why it is more of a qualitative term. We actually use the fertility as a measure to suggest the number of children that can be born. And through that, we come to a quantifiable term, or it is a qualitative term. So this is a term which I have been using from the start of the lecture. Even in the definition also, you should be very clear with the concept of qualitative and quantitative. So these are the 3 differences. Now let's see what are the other aspects. Whenever we are studying fertility, it is basically female or women-centric term, because the birth is given by female. So when we are talking fertility, it is going to be in reference to the female gender, right? When we are talking about fecundity, we are referring to both the sexes, because it is a biological capacity. Now, as I mentioned earlier also, if the testicles of a male are missing, both the testicles are missing, his biological capacity is not there. So we are referring to the male also. And obviously, in case of female, if the uterus is missing, the biological capacity is not going to be there. So when we refer to fecundity, we are basically referring to both the genders or both the sexes, male and female. When we are talking about fertility, we are basically referring to the female. Now, another important or 2 important aspects. When we are referring to fertility, the opposite of that is infertility. I'll explain the terms correctly before let me write. When we are referring to fecundity, the term opposite to it is sterility. Right? Now, just understand one thing. In the examination, the question has not been asked, like for example, write a note on sterility, but it can be asked. Why I have mentioned them, I'm going to explain you also. The reason is because it is a related term. And when we had, when generally what happens is when we see sterility, we think it is similar to infertility, what major difference could have been, but actually there are major differences between them. And you should understand these 2 concepts also very well. Now let's see what it means. When we are talking about infertility, it means the person has the capacity to reproduce, or for that matter, we're talking about a female. The female has the capacity to reproduce, but for the timing, she's not reproducing. Let's take an example. When we talk about a term known as, let's say, postpartum infertility, right? It means as the woman has given birth to a child, for certain duration due to various hormonal changes and the menstruation cycle does not resume immediately, there is a duration for which the woman is not able to reproduce. That period is known as the postpartum infertility. Now what does it mean? She does not have the capacity to reproduce for certain duration. It does not mean she does not have the biological capacity to reproduce. That means it is a temporary phase, right? This is the concept of infertility, right? Now when we come to sterility, sterility means that the person, male or female, does not have the biological capacity to reproduce. Now this can be in the case of, for example, transgenders. They do not have the biological capacity to reproduce. In case of a male, probably because the testicles might be missing. Probably in case of female, the uterus might be missing. So they do not have the biological capacity. So now it is important you understand the differences even between infertility and sterility, right? This term, even these two terms can be asked in the examination. They might, instead of asking you fertility and fecundity, they can ask you, write the differences between infertility and sterility. Then you're going to relate these terms to the other aspects also and write an effective answer. So students, till now what we have studied what is fertility from the layman's perspective and even from the anthropological point of view. We have studied fecundity, we have studied the relationship between them, and we've studied the differences between both the terminologies. Now let's see what are the factors that basically influence the fecundity. See, when the question comes in the examination, you actually do not have much time to write. See, it's very important you mention the point, write an example, probably a diagram or some case study, something, and present it in a proper manner and move forward. So that saves on the time, makes your answer effective, and also fetches you better marks. So let's start with the factor influencing fecundity. Now students, age is a very important factor. There was a study done by University of Maryland. Now they had used Indian census data and various studies and they basically came to a conclusion which I'm summing up using a graph. What they observed is there is a certain period in which the fecundity or potential to reproduce is maximum, and they came out that was 20 to 30 years, right? And for your understanding, this study was women-centric, though fecundity had mentioned relates both to the male and female, but this study was done on women, and they found that 20 and 30 was a time which was a maximum potential. At that time, maximum potential was there for the women to reproduce. So this was a study done by Maryland. Now what happens is, that means age is a period in which fecundity is being influenced by it. Before that also it is less, and after that definitely due to age related factors the fecundity cannot be maximum, and this is what is the maximum potential or the age in which the fecundity is maximum. So this is one of the studies done by age. So when you get a point age, you have to write like age is an important factor which is an influencing factor for fecundity, and then simply write what is a case study related to that. For that what happens is the examiner knows that you have studied the point or the dimension well. You don't have to write stories or cook up stories. The moment you start writing stories, you are not going to get your marks. So just be aware of the fact that this simple graph sums up every dimension of your fecundity related to the age. So let's come on to the next dimension, frequency and the timing of the sexual intercourse. Now, what does the concept of timing and frequency mean? Let's make a diagram and understand, right? For example, let me draw a uterus. Now supposingly these are the ovaries. This is the fallopian tube, and definitely this is the uterine wall and uterus per se, right? Now imagine when the eggs are being released, right? When the eggs are being released, at that time when the sexual intercourse takes place, the tendency or the potential to reproduce definitely increases, right? If it is a correct, and that is why many times happens that people though indulge in sexual intercourse, but they cannot conceive because of this factor. So that means correct timing is very important. And secondly, the frequency, the number of time the sexual intercourse is happening during the time when the ovulation is taking place, definitely the probability of having a child increases, right? So the frequency and the timing of the sexual intercourse plays a very important role if we have to study the concept of fecundity. For example, if the eggs are being released and that time sexual activity is taking place, the probability increases, right? So that is why. And the number of times it's taking place, that also definitely increases the probability. So the frequency and the timing of sexual intercourse is a very important factor. Now let's take on to the next aspect, nutrition and exercise. See, even the World Health Organization in the recent report talked about obesity. See, in obesity they mentioned that now because of overweight and all, what happens is that hormonal imbalances are a very common occurrence. Hormonal imbalances, an important term, this which WHO basically used when they conducted the study with respect to the obesity. According to World Health Organization, due to obesity, various hormonal imbalances are taking place, and because of that, what is happening is various miscarriages are taking place, or even the women are not able to conceive. So that means what is your nutrition, what is your health dimension, whether you are exercising, whether you are fit or not, is a very important determining factor about your biological capacity to reproduce. So that means these two factors play a very important role with respect to the fecundity. Now students, this what we have studied till now is only about 5% of this topic of fertility and fecundity. If you want to understand more, if you want to get a grasp of what this topic is and various other topics of anthropology optional, stay tuned, keep studying. We're going to soon come up with the anthropology optional, which you're going to relish, enjoy, and start loving the optional. Stay tuned. Take care.